Tonight, we're stripping away the dust-coated myths of the Hollywood frontier and stepping into the raw, unforgiving reality of life in the American West during the 1870s. No noble duels at high noon, no gleaming revolvers, no glamorous cowboys riding into painted sunsets. Just the truth, bleak, brutal, and astonishingly human. You've woken up in a time and place where survival isn't just uncertain, it's an achievement. The American frontier doesn't care about your plans or your toughness. Out here, nature is indifferent, society is disjointed, and danger lurks in the mundane as much as the dramatic. Even before you open your eyes, something assaults you. The smell. It isn't fresh pine or the crisp scent of mountain air. It's the sour reek of unwashed bodies, livestock waste, damp straw, and possibly raw sewage. Cleanliness was a rare indulgence in the Wild West. Baths, a monthly event at best, more commonly avoided for entire seasons. Water was life, and using it to scrub yourself clean was considered an extravagance. You stir in bed, if you can call it that. Likely a sack of straw infested with lice and bed bugs. Every joint protests. And why wouldn't it? Frontier life demands back-breaking labor from sun up to sundown. Your body is your only tool, and one that wears out fast. Whether you're a farmer tilling rock-hard soil, a miner digging through poisonous dust, or a ranch hand driving restless cattle, you're pushing your frame towards an early grave. It's no surprise many were bent double with arthritis by their 30s. You sit up. If it's winter, your cabin may be below freezing. If it's summer, the stifling heat is already pressing in, with no relief in sight. There's no insulation, no central heating, no cooling breeze unless nature feels generous. Your clothing offers little comfort, thick, coarse fabric that scrapes your skin. Men owned perhaps 2 sets of rough work clothes. Women endured multiple layers regardless of the heat. Corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that soaked up dirt like a sponge. Your stomach rumbles. Breakfast, if you're lucky, is a bowl of beans, a stale biscuit, and a cup of something they call coffee. It's black, burnt, and possibly flavored with eggshells or even gunpowder to cut the bitterness. Meat, when you get it, has been smoked or salted to keep it from rotting, and fresh produce is a rare seasonal treat. Vitamin deficiencies are common. Scurvy, yes, the one where your gums bleed and your teeth drop out, is still very much a threat. And before you step outside, don't forget to check your boots. Scorpions and snakes love warm, dark places. One careless move could mean a venomous bite and miles from help. That's a death sentence. You push open the creaking door of your shack and the light stings your eyes. But what really hits you is the exposure, the vulnerability. The landscape stretches for miles in every direction, wild and imposing. It's breathtaking, yes, but also utterly unforgiving. The land doesn't offer comfort, it offers indifference. One shift in the weather and you could be caught in a sudden storm, a dust cloud, or a flash flood, nature's wrath, with no warning and no second chances. In winter, temperatures plunge far below freezing. In summer, they soar into suffocating heat. Shelter helps only slightly. Your cabin leaks. Your roof groans under snow or collapses in a downpour. You don't control your environment here. You endure it. If you're based in a town, don't assume you've reached safety. Settlements on the frontier were chaotic jumbles of cabins, tents, and hastily assembled timber structures. Town planning was a fantasy. The streets? Dirt tracks, thick with mud in the wet and choking dust in the dry. Sanitation didn't exist. Horse manure lines the roads, sometimes knee-deep, attracting flies by the swarm. The air is heavy with the stench of waste, sweat, and decay. Disease thrives here. Cholera, smallpox, typhoid, diphtheria, pick your poison. One outbreak could wipe out half a town within weeks. No germ theory, no hygiene practices, and certainly no antibiotics. A simple cough could mark the beginning of the end. You wander past the local saloon, a far cry from the lively watering holes of Western films. It's a grim, wooden room filled with the scent of sweat, smoke, and desperation. No piano players, no glamorous barmaids, just rough men downing vile concoctions, whiskey spiked with turpentine, tobacco juice, or even gunpowder. A single drink could put you in the grave, or worse, it could land you in a fight. Because here's another myth undone. The Wild West wasn't filled with noble gunfighters. Most violence wasn't elegant or honorable. It was sudden, drunken, and deadly. Tempers flared fast in a world filled with stress, weapons, and alcohol. And while everyone carried a firearm, it wasn't for show. It was survival against wild animals, outlaws, or nature itself. Oddly enough, some frontier towns were stricter about gun control than modern ones. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood, many of them required visitors to hand over their weapons upon entering. The infamous shootout at the OK Corral? It started over a weapons ordinance dispute, but laws weren't reliable. Sheriffs were scarce, judges often corrupt or completely absent. Justice was more often meted out with a rope than a gavel. Accusation alone could get you hanged. No trial, no defense, just a tree and a mob. And still, the town is your best chance of human contact. So you press on, wary, tired, and already missing the dubious safety of your shack. You find yourself passing a small wooden shack with a crooked sign outside, "Doctor." You'd be forgiven for walking straight past. It looks no different from any other rundown structure in town, and inside, the reality is worse. Medical care on the frontier was not just inadequate, it was terrifying. Most so-called doctors had minimal training. Some learned their trade from books. Others never formally studied at all. Surgery, when performed, was done with whiskey as anesthetic, if you were lucky. Instruments were reused without sterilization. Infection was not an accident, it was an expectation. A deep cut on your leg? You'd better hope it doesn't turn red. Because if it does, and that angry red streak starts climbing, you're not getting antibiotics. You're getting amputation. Possibly with a rusty saw and a belt to bite on. Mercury was still prescribed. Arsenic, too. Bleeding patients was standard practice. The logic? Let out the bad humors. In practice, it just made things worse. Childbirth, far from being a private moment, was a deadly gamble. 1 in 4 women in remote areas died giving birth. If complications arose, there was almost nothing to be done. No hospitals, no prenatal care, no sterile instruments, just the hope that the baby came fast and the bleeding stopped on its own. As for dentistry, you'd be better off yanking the tooth yourself. Dentists, when they existed, used tools that wouldn't look out of place in a torture chamber. There were no painkillers. Extractions were done by force. Gums rotted. Teeth blackened. Most people lost their teeth young and lived with constant pain. Mental health? It wasn't recognized. The psychological weight of life out here, isolation, grief, exhaustion, broke many. Depression was called prairie madness or simply weakness of the soul. Treatment ranged from being ignored to being locked in a room, if not simply abandoned. So if you're injured, sick, or struggling, you're on your own. You might try a folk remedy passed down by your grandmother. You might pray. You might drink until it hurts less. But in most cases, you just hope Hope your body holds out one more day. Your stomach growls again, and you decide it's time to find something to eat. But out here, feeding yourself isn't a matter of choice. It's a relentless chore. The frontier diet was built around what could survive the journey, the climate, or both. That means beans, cornmeal, salt pork, again and again, 4 weeks at a time. Forget the luxury of variety. Fresh fruit, a fleeting luxury if you grew it yourself. Vegetables, seasonal at best, overcooked into a tasteless mush to make them last. In winter, scurvy made the rounds. Bleeding gums, aching joints, teeth falling out, all because you've not seen a piece of citrus in 6 months. Meat, if you had access to it, it was salted, smoked, or dried until it resembled leather. Game was plentiful early on. Deer, rabbits, birds, but it took time, skill, and precious ammunition to hunt. And if your gun jammed or your aim failed, you'd go hungry. Powder wasn't cheap, bullets even less so. Preserving food was a necessity and a full-time job. You couldn't waste anything. Women spent endless hours drying fruit, pickling vegetables, rendering fat for storage, or smoking slabs of meat. If done poorly, spoilage was inevitable and deadly. Botulism, dysentery, and food poisoning claimed more lives than gunfights ever did. What about pests? They were everywhere. Your sacks of flour, corn, and beans were likely crawling with weevils. Mice gnawed through grain. Rats defiled your water supply. And yes, everyone ate food with a bit of extra protein now and then. You either picked the bugs out or ignored them. Complaining wasn't an option. Cooking itself was a punishing task. There were no gas ovens, no electricity, just fire. If you were lucky, you had a stove that required near constant tending. Otherwise, it was an open hearth and whatever fuel you could scavenge. In tree-scarce regions, women and children would collect buffalo dung to burn, dried and stacked like firewood. Water? Every drop had to be fetched by hand, often from questionable sources shared with animals. Boiling it was advisable if you had the time or fuel to spare. Many didn't and paid the price with cholera or typhoid. And yet, despite all this, obesity was rare because there simply wasn't enough food, and everything you did burned calories. People were lean, but not in the healthy sense. Malnutrition left bones brittle, growth stunted, and immune systems weak. Children suffered the worst. If they survived infancy, and many didn't, their diet set them up for a lifetime of health problems. So as you sit down to your meal of cold beans and hard bread, maybe washed down with bitter coffee or metallic-tasting water, know this: every bite has been earned, and every mouthful is a small, daily victory against the odds. Let's say you've had enough of your little settlement and decide to leave town. Maybe you're searching for work, new land, or simply chasing the half-whispered promise of fortune elsewhere. Bad news: getting anywhere out here is a gamble, and the house always has the upper hand. By the 1870s, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, a marvel of engineering that stitched the country together. But unless you were relatively wealthy, well-connected, or traveling between major hubs, you wouldn't be riding it. Most people made their way by wagon, horseback, or their own blistered feet. If you had a horse, consider yourself among the lucky and the financially stretched. A decent horse cost several months' wages, not to mention the price of feed, tack, and constant care. And if your animal got lame, sick, or broke a leg, that was that. There was no veterinary rescue. You put it down and walked. Wagons, meanwhile, were a different kind of misery. Forget the cozy image of cheerful families bouncing over prairie grass. In reality, wagon travel was torturous. With no suspension and wheels that thudded over every rock and rut, passengers were jolted relentlessly. The result? Wagon sickness, a nauseating mix of motion and dust, was common. Spines compressed, teeth rattled. Roads were a laughable idea. Most trails were just worn paths gouged into the wilderness by previous travelers. In rain, they turned to mud bogs. In drought, to blinding dust clouds. Wheel axles cracked, wagons tipped, and when that happened, there was no roadside assistance, just you, your tools, and whatever parts you hoped you'd packed. For those journeying further west, along the Oregon Trail perhaps, the dangers compounded. That route became known as the nation's longest graveyard. Cholera outbreaks could sweep through wagon trains like wildfire. A person could seem fine in the morning and be buried by dusk. Rivers had to be forded, sometimes floated across, and many drowned. Accidents with livestock, firearms, or cooking fires were tragically routine. Even shorter trips weren't safe. Robbers preyed on isolated travelers. Stagecoach heists, exaggerated in legend, were still very real. And then there were the natural threats: flash floods, snake bites, sudden blizzards, or heat so intense it cooked you from the inside out. Getting lost was perhaps the quietest killer of all. Without accurate maps or signs, one wrong turn could send you miles off course into empty territory with no food, no water, and no one coming to help. So when you picture the freedom of the open plains, remember that every step was a roll of the dice. Travel on the frontier wasn't liberating, it was life-threatening. Close your eyes and picture the Wild West. Odds are, what springs to mind is a white cowboy on horseback, perhaps a Native American warrior in pursuit, or a saloon shootout between grim-faced men and dusters. That's the myth. The reality? Far more diverse and far more complicated. The American West in the 1870s wasn't a whitewashed land of rugged individualists. It was a convergence point, a rough mosaic of cultures, languages, and ambitions drawn from across the world. Chinese immigrants laid the railroads, their labor cheap and their lives expendable in the eyes of employers. They blasted through mountains with unstable explosives, often with no protection. And when the railway was done, many were driven out of towns that no longer wanted them. They faced brutal racism, violence, and discriminatory laws, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal immigration restriction in the United States. Mexican families, many of whom had lived in the Southwest long before it became American territory, saw their land seized by force or buried under legal trickery. Treaty promises were broken as quickly as they were made. Their water rights, deeply rooted in Spanish tradition and adapted to the arid landscape, were often overridden by English common law, poorly suited to the environment, but beneficial to those with political sway. Black Americans, fleeing the suffocating racism of the South after the Civil War, sought new beginnings in the West. Some became farmers, others cowboys. In fact, up to a quarter of all cowboys were black. But recognition was rare, and discrimination was simply repackaged, not erased. And then, of course, there were the Native American nations, dozens of them, each with their own languages, economies, and traditions, had lived in and cared for these lands for thousands of years. The westward push of white settlers, backed by the U.S. military and government policy, devastated them. This was no peaceful relocation, it was systematic erasure. Broken treaties, forced removals, bison slaughter, and boarding schools designed to obliterate culture. The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," wasn't metaphorical. It was policy. Contrary to film depictions, Native American attacks on settlers were relatively rare and often responses to aggression rather than unprovoked violence. Many tribes initially tried diplomacy, trade, or adaptation. It was repeated betrayal and encroachment that pushed some to war. The Wild West wasn't just violent in terms of warfare, it was socially combustible. Tensions between different immigrant groups, religious factions, and class divisions simmered constantly. Riots, lynchings, and vigilante justice were regular features of this volatile society. Frontier justice didn't ask your name. It looked at your face, your accent, and your station in life. Still, despite the conflict, this crucible of cultures shaped the identity of the American West in ways that can't be erased. Music, food, language, farming methods, architecture, much of what we now associate with the West emerged from this cultural collision. But the power dynamics were clear. Some cultures were celebrated, others were silenced. Some histories were recorded, others were burned, forgotten, or overwritten. So next time someone tells you the West was won, ask, who lost? If you believe what old Western films tell you, women on the frontier were either schoolmarms, saloon girls, or damsels in distress. The truth? Women were the very foundation of frontier life, unpaid, unrecognized, and unrelenting. On homesteads and in cabins, women did far more than cook and raise children. They worked the land, mended roofs, shot predators, and helped deliver babies, sometimes their own, sometimes neighbors. Their daily reality was a brutal mix of physical exhaustion, emotional endurance, and constant improvisation. A typical day for a frontier woman might begin before dawn. First, tend to the fire, then prepare breakfast, fetch water from a well or stream, feed livestock, milk cows, clean, sew, preserve food, wash clothes by hand, homeschool children, nurse the sick, mend tools, and perhaps, in between, give birth. Then get dinner on. Days off didn't exist. Rest wasn't a luxury. It was an unthinkable indulgence. Many women returned to field work or heavy domestic labor mere days after childbirth. They had no choice. Most frontier women had no legal identity of their own. If married, they couldn't own property, sign contracts, or keep custody of their children in a divorce. If widowed, they became heads of households by default, expected to run the land, raise children alone, and fend off opportunists keen on taking what little they had. Teachers were often young, unmarried women, one of the few respectable jobs available. But even that came with strings, low pay, short contracts, and an expectation to resign if they married. Many lived in isolation, far from family or support, enduring long winters with only their pupils and thoughts for company. Then there were the so-called soiled doves, women who worked in saloons and brothels. Their stories have been mythologized, but the truth was grim. Many were forced into sex work by abandonment, poverty, or trafficking. Conditions were unsanitary. Abuse was rampant. Diseases were rife. There were few options for escape and fewer for redemption. Yet frontier women weren't entirely without power. In places where their presence was scarce, communities competed to attract and keep them. Some territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women the right to vote decades before the 19th Amendment. Practical necessities sometimes outweighed societal prejudice. Still, even the strongest, most resourceful women of the frontier often remain absent from its legend. Their courage wasn't wielded with pistols or performed in saloons. It was lived daily, quietly, through loss, labor, and resilience that the films simply don't know how to show. They weren't ornaments, they were infrastructure. When you picture frontier justice, it's usually a lone sheriff in a dusty town, facing off against some black-hatted outlaw at high noon. Order prevails, the crowd cheers, and decency is restored. That image, pure fantasy. The truth is messier and far more unsettling. In many frontier towns, law enforcement was patchy at best. Sheriffs were often elected by popularity rather than competence, and their jurisdictions could span thousands of square miles. With no radio, no car, and often no backup, they had little hope of responding to most crimes, let alone preventing them. Marshals, deputized citizens, and hastily formed posses made up the rest of the justice system. Many were just as likely to be drunk, corrupt, or personally invested in the outcome as the people they were chasing. Professionalism wasn't the norm, it was an exception. Legal infrastructure was minimal. Judges were rare, trials even rarer, and appeals practically non-existent. Justice was often handled in the streets, not the courtroom. Accusations of horse theft or cattle rustling could earn you a noose and a crowd by sunset. Evidence, optional. Suspicion alone could be fatal. Vigilante groups were common, sometimes acting as genuine community protectors, more often enforcing local prejudice. If you were black, Chinese, Mexican, or simply a stranger, you were doubly vulnerable. Frontier justice didn't lean toward fairness. It leaned toward speed and certainty, and that often meant death. And those famous shootouts, not exactly the duels of legend. The quick-draw showdowns beloved by cinema were vanishingly rare. Most violence happened in back alleys, saloons, or ambushes, fueled by alcohol, jealousy, or petty grudges. There was little honor, and even less warning. Gun ownership was common, yes, but not necessarily as glamorous as it's been portrayed. Most folks carried weapons out of necessity, to hunt, to defend against animals, or to signal across distance. In fact, several frontier towns, including Tombstone and Dodge City, enforced strict gun control within town limits. The myth of the armed and free West conveniently ignores the signs that read, "Check your firearms with the sheriff." And when criminals did emerge, famous names like Jesse James or Billy the Kid, they often straddled the line between outlaw and folk hero, depending on who was telling the story. Their deeds were exaggerated, their legends crafted not by fact, but by newspapers and dime novels desperate for readers. Law in the Wild West wasn't about good triumphing over evil. It was about survival, reputation, and sometimes sheer dumb luck. If you managed to live through it, that didn't make you righteous, just lucky enough to avoid someone else's bullet or rope. The gold rush, that glittering lure of sudden fortune, drew thousands west with visions of striking it rich. Tales were told of men plucking nuggets the size of fists from shallow streams, of fortunes made overnight. But for every prospector who found even a scrap of gold, there were hundreds who found nothing but ruin. By the 1870s, the glory days of easy pickings were long gone. The richest veins had been claimed years earlier, and what remained was locked deep within the rock, requiring hard, dangerous labor and expensive equipment to extract. The age of the lone prospector with a pan had given way to the era of mining corporations, and with it came some of the harshest working conditions imaginable. Let's say you managed to stake a claim. The process alone required navigating labyrinthine paperwork, paying fees you could barely afford, and defending your patch of land from squatters, claim jumpers, or dishonest officials. If someone wanted your mine badly enough, they could simply take it, by trickery or by force. Assuming you held on to it, the real work began. Placer mining, the romantic image of sifting gold from riverbeds, left you bent over in ice-cold water for hours, your hands cracked and bleeding. Hard rock mining, however, was another beast entirely. You'd crawl into claustrophobic tunnels, hammer and blast through solid stone, breathing in clouds of dust laced with deadly minerals. A single misfire with black powder or dynamite could collapse the shaft or tear your limbs apart. Toxic gases, odorless and lethal, crept silently through the tunnels. Black damp, white damp, and fire damp were terms every miner feared. And even if you weren't killed outright, every breath poisoned you slowly. Silicosis, mercury poisoning, and lead exposure ruined your lungs, your brain, your body, all while you earned a few dollars a day. If you were injured, there was no compensation, no safety net. You were simply done. If you survived the mines but aged out of the work, too bent or breathless to continue, you'd be discarded and replaced. No pension, no second chance. And then there were the towns that sprung up around the mines, thrown together shanties of wood and canvas, populated mostly by men. Women were scarce. Churches and schools, scarcer still. But there were always saloons, gambling dens, brothels. Drunkenness wasn't just common, it was expected. It dulled the pain, masked the futility. Sanitation was non-existent. Human waste was dumped in streets or rivers. Disease moved quickly, especially in summer when the heat turned everything rotten. Typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis. Miners dropped as fast from illness as they did from accidents. And if you were lucky enough to dig something valuable out of the earth, good luck keeping it. Banks were few, and reliable ones even fewer. You might be forced to sell your gold to a local saloon owner or merchant at half its worth. Some miners carried gold dust in pouches, risking robbery or worse. Others were swindled by false scales, forged deeds, or friendly men who vanished with their wealth overnight. Despite all this, people came in droves. They came chasing freedom, fortune, or the fantasy of control over their own lives. Most left with empty hands, broken bodies, or graves with no names. The mines gave up wealth, yes, but not to the miners. Few images are more ingrained in the mythology of the American West than that of the cowboy, independent, fearless, galloping across the open plains with the wind at his back and freedom in his veins. But like most frontier myths, the truth is far grittier and far less glamorous. By the 1870s, the cattle industry was booming. Demand for beef in eastern cities meant ranchers needed to move thousands of cattle hundreds of miles from Texas up to Kansas railheads. Thus began the great cattle drives, weeks or months-long treks across sun-scorched plains, through rivers, storms, and hostile terrain. You might imagine the cowboy as a gun-toting hero in fine boots and a spotless hat. In reality, most were teenage boys, recently freed slaves, Mexican vaqueros, or Native Americans. Up to a quarter of them were black. They earned about $30 a month, and they earned every cent of it. The work was relentless. Riders spent up to 20 hours a day in the saddle. Sleep was taken in snatches, sometimes upright on horseback. Meals consisted of beans, salt pork, and stale biscuits cooked over an open fire. Clean water was precious. Hygiene was non-existent. Illness spread quickly. The dangers were constant. River crossings could turn fatal in moments if the herd spooked. A misstep, a startled steer, or a slippery bank could see a cowboy crushed or drowned. Stampedes were the most feared. Thunderous chaos triggered by lightning, loud noises, or even a bad dream. Thousands of panicked cattle could flatten everything in their path. Getting caught in the middle meant death. And when the drive ended, there was no reward. No celebration, just another job waiting, more cattle to move, more risk to take. Cowboys didn't become wealthy. They didn't retire with land or prestige. Most lived hard, died young, and were buried in unmarked graves. Even day-to-day ranching, for those who stayed on the range, was unforgiving. Droughts could kill entire herds. Winter storms like the deadly winter of 1886-87 froze cattle in place by the tens of thousands. Diseases like Texas fever spread without warning. Predators and rustlers added to the toll. A rancher's entire livelihood could vanish in a single season, and yet they endured, out of necessity, not romance. The cowboy life wasn't a song or a storybook. It was blistered hands, saddle sores, and bone-deep exhaustion. It was grit without glory. So next time you see a cowboy riding into the sunset, remember, he's not chasing freedom. He's chasing livestock on a trail that will chew him up and leave barely a whisper behind. If the cowboy chased cattle, the settler chased a dream, the promise of land, freedom, and a future built with one's own two hands. The U.S. government dangled that vision through the Homestead Act of 1862. 160 acres, free of charge, if you could live on and improve it for 5 years. Thousands set off across the plains, believing they'd found their Eden. They hadn't. What they found was toil, torment, and terrain that fought them every step of the way. Let's start with the land itself. 160 acres might sound generous, but in the dry plains of Kansas, Nebraska, or the Dakotas, it was barely enough to survive. Rain was scarce, soil was stubborn. Farming methods brought from the east simply didn't work out west. Many settlers had no idea how to work with arid land, and failure came quickly. First came the sod house, the soddy. With no timber on the treeless plains, settlers hacked out dense prairie grass and stacked it into crude walls. These homes were dark, damp, infested with bugs, snakes, and rodents. When it rained, they leaked. When the wind blew, they moaned. When you lived in one, you prayed for mercy. Plowing the land was backbreaking. The dense sod resisted every blade. Simple tools often broke under the strain. It could take an entire year just to prepare enough soil for planting, and even then, success was never guaranteed. Once crops were in, settlers had to contend with an endless gauntlet of threats. Drought, flash floods, hailstorms, early frosts, fires sparked by lightning or carelessness. And then came the locusts, clouds of grasshoppers so thick they blotted out the sun, devouring everything in sight, including clothing and wooden tool handles. Illness was another constant threat. A fever at the wrong time, during planting or harvest, could mean starvation. There were no neighbors nearby to lend a hand. Women worked through pregnancies, children worked alongside adults, and injuries could spell ruin. And even if you did manage a successful harvest, getting your crops to market was its own battle. Without refrigeration, produce spoiled quickly. Railroads charged whatever they liked to transport goods. Many settlers found that by the time they'd paid off shipping, taxes, and supply costs, they'd made less than nothing. And yet they stayed. Or they tried. Some gave up and returned east, broken in body and spirit. Others stayed because they had no choice. Debt, shame, or stubbornness rooted them to the land. A few succeeded, but only through endless hardship and sheer force of will. The truth? Farming on the frontier wasn't freedom. It was servitude, not to a master, but to the soil, the sky, and a system that promised independence but delivered punishment. If the frontier broke you, if your farm failed, your horse died, or your claim ran dry, you might try your hand at something else, wage work. It promised stability, a regular income, and fewer risks than mining, ranching, or homesteading. But safety, security, dignity, those were luxuries the frontier rarely gave out, especially to the working poor. The industries that grew alongside westward expansion were as punishing as the land itself. Logging, rail construction, milling, smelting, and building work offered pay, yes, but at a price. One measured in fingers, limbs, breath, and blood. Let's take railway labor. The transcontinental line may have connected the country, but it was built on shattered bodies. Chinese immigrants were tasked with the most dangerous jobs, hanging from cliffs with black powder strapped to their chests, tunneling through mountains with little more than picks, bare hands, and forced endurance. Death from collapses, blasts, or exposure was so frequent it barely merited mention. Logging was no less lethal. Felling massive trees without protective gear or knowledge of safe cutting techniques led to crushed limbs, concussions, or worse. Even transporting timber was dangerous. Logs snapped loose, crushed wagons, or rolled over unsuspecting workers. Mills and foundries weren't much better. Machinery had no guards, no fail-safes, and no training requirements. Clothing could catch in gears. Sparks could ignite fumes. Molten metal could splash without warning. Injuries were treated with folk remedies, if at all. A severed hand ended your career and your usefulness. Construction offered another set of risks. Workers built taller structures using makeshift scaffolding, often with no harnesses or safety nets. A single misstep meant a fatal fall. Those who survived such accidents frequently faced lifelong pain and disability. And child labor? It was everywhere. Children as young as 8 worked in mines, factories, or on rail gangs. They were cheaper, easier to control, and more likely to be sacrificed when something went wrong. Smaller hands meant they could fit between gears, after all. Wages were paltry. The workday ran 10 to 12 hours, 6 or 7 days a week. No sick leave. No holidays. No pensions. If you got injured or sick, you were fired and replaced by someone more desperate. Attempts to unionize or demand better conditions often ended in blacklisting or violence. Company towns added insult to injury. In many remote areas, mining and timber companies built entire communities, owned the houses, the shops, the banks. Workers were paid in company scrip, usable only at inflated prices in company stores. It was a closed system designed to keep laborers in permanent debt, trapped, broke, and expendable. You might think wage work was a safer bet than owning land or chasing gold. But the truth is, the frontier didn't care what you chose. Danger came with every option. The question wasn't whether you'd suffer. It was when and how badly. Out on the frontier, time wasn't measured in minutes or schedules. It was measured in daylight, seasons, and what your body could accomplish before it gave out. There were no 9-to-5s, no clocks ticking away in tidy corners. There was only work, and the brief, stolen moments between it. The sun woke you. The cold put you to sleep. During harvest, you might work from first light until stars filled the sky, day after day without pause. In winter, with the land frozen and the days short, you might finally rest, if your supplies held out and your roof didn't cave in. Tasks weren't timed. They were done until they were finished. Plow the field, chop the wood, mend the roof, deliver the calf, fetch the water. There was no later when survival depended on now. So what did people do for leisure? if such a word even applied. Evenings, if you weren't too exhausted, meant conversation by firelight. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was education, connection, and therapy. Neighbors might gather for music if someone had a fiddle or harmonica. A deck of cards or a simple board game might circulate through a community for years. Books were rare but treasured. A single volume could be passed from family to family until it fell apart. Newspapers arrived weeks or months late, read aloud and dissected as if they held the secrets of the universe. Literacy wasn't taken for granted. It was a gift, a skill, a defiance of the wilderness. Dances and religious holidays brought temporary joy. A barn dance after harvest, a Christmas gathering, the 4th of July, when neighbors from 20 miles in every direction might come together for food, music, and the comfort of shared struggle. These weren't grand events, they were reminders that you weren't alone. Children, despite the hard labor expected of them, found ways to play. They made up games with rocks, sticks, and scraps. They chased each other, climbed trees, and mimicked the work of their parents. There were no toys, no screens, just imagination and what the land offered. Even in the grimmest conditions, laughter existed. So did romance. So did hope. Couples courted at dances or church gatherings. Families sang together to ward off loneliness. Some settlers wrote poetry. Others sketched, carved, or stitched artistry into quilts and furniture, small acts of beauty in an otherwise brutal world. Life on the frontier demanded everything, but it didn't erase humanity. It bent it, weathered it, tested it, and still, people found ways to live beyond the work. Because even out here, where survival overshadowed all else, people clung to stories, music, ritual, and each other. Not to escape hardship, but to endure it. The frontier was beautiful, majestic even. Rolling plains like an endless sea, towering mountains sharp against the sky, rivers that glittered like silver. But for those pushing westward, beauty wasn't the point. Use was, profit was, control was, and so they tore it apart. Nature, to the settler mentality, wasn't something to live with. It was something to conquer. Forests were raised without thought for regrowth. Hills were gouged open for minerals. Rivers were diverted, dammed, and polluted to feed industry. The land was seen not as sacred, but as property, to be claimed, fenced, and exploited. No act better symbolized this ruthless mindset than the near extinction of the American bison. Once, millions of bison roamed the plains, an essential pillar of life for dozens of Native American nations. They provided food, clothing, tools, shelter. The bison was not simply hunted, it was honored. But to the U.S. government and expanding settlers, the bison was an obstacle. Worse, it was a lifeline for native peoples they sought to displace. And so the killing began. Herds were shot from trains for sport, skinned for hides, their carcasses left to rot. Piles of skulls rose like hills on the prairie, grim monuments to efficiency and indifference. By the 1880s, fewer than 1,000 remained. This wasn't simply overhunting, it was policy. Eliminate the bison, and you eliminate the backbone of native survival. General Philip Sheridan, whether apocryphally or not, reportedly endorsed the slaughter as a tool of war. Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance. That so-called peace came at a staggering cost, ecological and human. The loss of the bison wasn't an isolated incident. Beaver populations had already been decimated for the fur trade. Wolves, bears, and cougars were hunted relentlessly. Forests were stripped without replanting. Prairie sod was turned under and replaced with unfamiliar crops, leading to erosion and drought. Streams, once teeming with life, were poisoned by mining runoff. Hillsides collapsed from careless logging. Grasslands turned to dust under the hooves of too many cattle. The land itself began to rebel, slowly, then violently. Droughts became more severe. Flooding worsened. Dust storms in later decades would turn midday into night. The damage done in the name of civilization would haunt generations long after the frontier was declared closed. But back then, few cared. The priority was extraction, not preservation. Control, not coexistence. The land gave until it couldn't, and the West, wild no longer, began to wither beneath the weight of its exploitation. Long before settlers drew borders, plowed fields, or named mountains after presidents, this land had stories. It had languages older than the Constitution, trade routes older than railroads, and spiritual bonds deeper than any fence post could reach. Dozens of native nations, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, Nez Perce, Comanche, and many more, had called the American West home for centuries. Their cultures weren't primitive. They were complex, adaptive, and deeply rooted in the landscapes now being torn apart. And yet, as settlers surged westward, the prevailing view wasn't one of respect. It was eradication. Native Americans were seen as obstacles to progress, painted as either noble savages to be pitied or violent threats to be eliminated. The truth, inconvenient to manifest destiny, was more nuanced. Many tribes attempted peaceful coexistence. They signed treaties, welcomed trade, even tried to adapt. But time and again, those treaties were broken, often as soon as gold, silver, or fertile land was discovered nearby. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had already laid the groundwork. By the 1870s, removal became replacement. Tribes were forced onto reservations, often the least arable, most isolated lands imaginable. Those who resisted were met with force, military campaigns that scorched villages, massacred families, and destroyed food stores. Even the buffalo slaughter, once seen as collateral damage, was in truth a weapon. With their primary resource destroyed, Plains tribes were starved into submission. It was environmental warfare masquerading as inevitability. When violence didn't work, assimilation was the next tool. Native children were ripped from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or wearing traditional clothing. Hair was cut, names were changed, punishments were brutal. One slogan summed it up with chilling precision: kill the Indian, save the man. This was not education. It was cultural erasure. And the trauma it caused didn't end with those children. It echoed through generations. Despite all this, the image of cowboys and Indians persisted in popular culture, always with the settler as hero and the native as threat. The reality? Far more native lives were taken than settlers. And many tribes fought not out of aggression, but desperation. Battles like Little Bighorn were the exception, and even that victory was met with overwhelming retribution. By 1900, the indigenous population of North America had dropped from an estimated 15 million to fewer than 300,000, and yet they endured. Despite genocide, displacement, and the grinding machinery of assimilation, Native people survived. Their languages are still spoken. Their ceremonies are still held. Their sovereignty, long denied, is still fought for, honored, and slowly reclaimed. The story of the Wild West isn't just about expansion. It's also about the people pushed to the margins and what they lost: land, culture, lives. But it's also about what they kept and what they're reclaiming. Because the frontier didn't just end at a line on a map. Its consequences live on, and so do those who were meant to be forgotten. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the ragged edge of the Wild West began to change. The shanty towns of canvas and timber were slowly replaced by buildings of brick and stone. Streets were surveyed, then leveled. Lawmen became professionals. Telegraph lines hummed across the plains. And where there was once only dust and cattle, banks, schools, churches, and newspapers took root. The frontier wasn't ending. It was being reshaped, commercialized, regulated, absorbed. The driving force behind this transformation was the railroad. With the completion of the Transcontinental Line in 1869 and dozens of branch lines thereafter, even the most isolated settlements were suddenly connected to national markets. Timber from Oregon, wheat from Kansas, silver from Nevada, all could be shipped east in days rather than months. Goods from Boston or Chicago flooded back in return, changing everything from what settlers wore to what they ate. Towns boomed overnight, but they didn't grow up. They were bought out. The big mining outfits pushed out lone prospectors. Cattle empires swallowed small ranches. The banks backed the winners, and the losers found themselves in debt, desperate, or gone. Politics followed money. Local sheriffs and mayors were soon answering to railroad barons and mining magnates. Land rights, water rights, grazing permits, all were distributed by those with capital and connections, not those with calloused hands. Industry brought jobs, but also dependency. Company towns emerged, built and owned entirely by employers. Workers lived in company houses, bought food at company stores, and were paid in company-issued scrip. The result was debt bondage disguised as opportunity. Culturally, the West began to mirror the East. Protestant churches, fraternal lodges, and formal schools reinforced order. Saloons were replaced by cafes. Guns were checked at the door, not drawn in the street. Children learned patriotism, not survival. Respectability crept in like a cold fog. For those who had braved the early years, the ranchers, miners, homesteaders, drifters, it felt like the wilderness was being paved over. Many resisted. Some kept moving westward, chasing vanishing freedom. Others found themselves unable or unwilling to adapt. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau famously declared the frontier closed. There were no longer vast stretches of unclaimed land, no new edge to conquer. The mythmakers took note. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was already touring the world by then, a traveling theater of nostalgia, selling a version of the West that was fading fast, if it had ever existed at all. The real frontier didn't end with a gunshot or a handshake. It ended in paperwork, property lines, and corporate deeds. It ended when survival gave way to structure, not because the land had changed, but because the machinery of expansion had finally overtaken it. And yet, even as towns grew and railways spread, the West retained its contradictions. Freedom and control, independence and exploitation, grit and grief. Those tensions didn't disappear, they simply took new forms. The frontier wasn't dead, it had been domesticated. By the time the real West was being swept up in rail schedules, law books, and investment portfolios, a new West was being born, not in the dust of frontier trails, but on stages, in printing presses, and eventually on screens. This West wasn't dangerous. It was thrilling. It wasn't desperate. It was noble. It wasn't real, but it sold like nothing else. Buffalo Bill Cody was among the first to package the Wild West for public consumption. His traveling show, which launched in the 1880s, toured across the United States and Europe. Audiences were treated to reenactments of native attacks, sharpshooting exhibitions, cowboy trick riding, and dramatic portrayals of frontier justice. Many of the performers had indeed lived through the frontier era, including Sitting Bull himself, but what they presented was theater, not truth. Soon after, dime novels flooded the market. Churned out by the thousands, they offered tales of larger-than-life heroes and dastardly villains. Outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid became folk legends. Lawmen like Wyatt Earp were mythologized beyond recognition. Writers, most of whom had never seen the West, invented a version of it that bore only a passing resemblance to reality, clean, simple, and always entertaining. Hollywood followed suit. By the early 20th century, Westerns had become a dominant genre. Cowboys were clean-shaven and honorable. Native Americans were reduced to faceless threats or mystical sidekicks. Women were either angels or temptresses. Moral complexity? Not welcome on the frontier lot. These stories weren't harmless escapism, they became cultural memory. They shaped how generations understood American identity: rugged, righteous, self-reliant. They justified conquest as destiny. They buried uncomfortable truths beneath a glittering coat of cinematic dust. The Wild West, once filled with contradictions, diversity, and bloodied survival, had been flattened into a morality play. Good versus evil. Settler versus savage. Lawman versus outlaw. And in doing so, the stories forgot the miners crushed in tunnel collapses, the women who labored in sod huts, the children who died of fever, the immigrants who built the railroads and were cast aside, the native peoples who were driven from their lands, their voices silenced in history books and classrooms. The myth of the West became more powerful than its truth because it was easier to digest, easier to celebrate. But behind every gunfight choreographed for the stage, every horse galloping across the silver screen, lies a story untold, one of hardship, hope, loss, injustice, and resilience. The question now isn't why the myth was created. It's whether we're ready to see past it. The frontier is gone. The open plains are fenced. The buffalo are few. The railroads now carry tourists. The saloons sell craft beer. The once lawless towns have postcodes, mobile coverage, and historical societies. But the Wild West isn't dead. Not really. It lingers in the bones of the land, in the stories we tell, and in the values we still wrestle with. Many of the institutions forged in that crucible still shape American life. Land ownership laws, water rights disputes, state-federal tensions all carry DNA from frontier battles. The uneasy balance between personal freedom and collective responsibility, the mistrust of central authority, the celebration of rugged self-reliance, these weren't just Western attitudes. They were survival strategies. And they've been passed down, romanticized, politicized, and deeply embedded in national identity. Culturally, the West lives on in art, fashion, music, and language. Cowboy boots and denim didn't start as style. They were born of function. Country music, rooted in Appalachian ballads and frontier folk songs, still echoes themes of hardship and heartland endurance. And the cowboy himself, though reimagined countless times, remains an enduring archetype, the lone wanderer, the drifter, the man against the world. Yet the real legacy is more complex. It's the diversity often omitted from the myth. The Chinese railway workers, the black cowboys, the Mexican vaqueros, The women who built homes with bare hands, the native peoples who lost everything and still fight to preserve what remains. It's the environmental scars, rivers redirected, forests cut bare, land exhausted by short-sighted ambition. These wounds haven't healed. They've evolved into modern challenges of climate, sustainability, and resource conflict. It's the stories that were never told, the families that vanished in blizzards, the children buried without markers, the laughter around campfires, the music drifting from porches, the whispered prayers in 1,000 languages. To understand the West is not just to marvel at its violence or admire its grit. It's to recognize its contradictions, freedom built on displacement, opportunity carved from struggle, triumphs shadowed by injustice. Today, you can stand on the high plains, beneath skies unspoiled by city lights, and still feel something ancient stirring. The wind carries memory. The silence is deep enough to hold history. You might look up at the same stars that guided a wagon train or comforted a homesick settler, and realize the West was never just a place. It was an ordeal, a reckoning, a question. Can people build something lasting in the face of chaos? The answer lies not in the legends, but in the lives lived between them, in the daily persistence, the quiet endurance, the decision to stay, to try, to survive one more day. So when the myths fade and the dust settles, what's left of the Wild West? Just this: people, struggling, enduring, and leaving behind stories, raw, flawed, and entirely human.